Hey folks, welcome back to Gaming Garbage, where we take a look at games, chat about the gaming news in the industry, and of course, stream for fun. Today we're taking a look at Ashes of Creation, and we're starting to figure out actually what happened. Now, some of this is still not necessarily confirmed, or just kind of sprinkled through a little bit, but there is also multiple lawsuits. Yes, multiple lawsuits coming, and so we'll find out more certainly then. But I want to bring everyone up to speed, but first, let's go over kind of what we know already. Ashes of Creation, for those of you that don't know, is an MMORPG by Intrepid Studios. They've roughly had 8 years to actually develop this, heading toward 9, and they started a KickStarter, and they necessarily didn't want any like third-party publisher or anything like that, but there is something in the Kickstarter that is interesting. But as we can see, people are not very happy about this. This also used to be mixed because, again, the game didn't necessarily launch with a ton of content. There were certainly some bugs and stuff, and for 8 years it seemed a little lacking. But yeah, technically the servers are actually running. When we take a look at Kickstarter here, this was going to be a pretty big game, and we see there's almost 20,000 backers for $3.2 million, which sounds like a really good chunk of money. And pretty much every single goal, they were able to get all of the backers that they wanted for that particular amount, except for the one of 10,000. They still had some of those left. But this was going to be pretty big. This was going to be a really big open world MMORPG. The world was going to be massive. We were going to have nodes too, so like there was going to be military, there's going to be an economy, politics would play its part, and there were also limited resources into the game. And this was quite the big, quite the big project. And two, there were devs from basically all over the place that had been working on games for quite some time. So it looked pretty good, and people were ultimately excited about this. The thing, though, that I think is interesting, let me find it first. So one thing, though, that I find it interesting is right here. We've got private backing that will allow us to produce a core viable product. And I think that's really important because that word private right there is going to mean everything as we start to go forward. So with their goal, with their funding, everything was going pretty well. Again, when they got the launch on Steam, which was December 11th, the early access things didn't necessarily go too well. It had roughly a 42% for the actual game, and they had 8 years of development heading toward 9. Earlier in January, there were ultimately 9 people that were laid off, but things were reassured that things were okay. Then we had something from Margaret Crone, who was a person basically operating like the communications for the studio and for the game. And she announced, first when that things were not necessarily going very well. She said she wanted to wait until today to share this, and I wanted to make sure I was communicating with a place of clarity. Intrepid Studios was shutting down in a way I did not expect. What I can share is what I experienced. On January 28th, toward the end of the workday, I was informed that we were being laid off with 100 developers. On January 29, we shared this information confidentially with the game service team. On the 30th, she spoke individually with each team member to let them know whether they were affected. And then on the 31st, they were all informed via a confusing email that they were all being laid off. In the end, none of us were receiving our final paychecks, the 60-day notice, and also the payout line under the Warrens Act and PTO and other compensation. So they weren't really getting any of that. It was just instantaneous, which is insane. We also found out, too, from Steve Sharif, posting on Discord, I cannot, which is right here, just for posterity's sake. I cannot make I can make a limited statement in my personal capacity and not on the behalf of the company regarding the situation. Control of the company shifted away from me, and the board began directing actions that I could not ethically agree with or carry out. As a result, I chose to resign in protest rather than lend my name or authority to decisions I could not ethically support. Following my resignation, much of the senior leadership team resigned. Following those departures, the board made the decision to issue a WARN Act notice and proceed with a mass layoff, which again, they didn't give those 90 days. I cannot responsibly speak to further detail at the time due to the ongoing legal and governance matters, etc. So yeah, this was ultimately the same day, which was crazy. So yeah, things were things were not going overly well. And the thing that's interesting is that the board was making the decisions, not necessarily the studio. And who was this board? The board is really a question mark. Insiders that talked to Kira on his YouTube channel and MMORPG.com were saying that the private equity firm had bought the studio and the rights to Ashes of Creation ultimately. Their plan was to lay off most of the devs and outsource the work to cheaper labor in some other country. Basically, they're going to keep 100 devs and 250 out of the 250, and the rest would be laid off. When Sharif and the leadership quit, well, the plans changed. And all of this is still a theory, but Sharif wants to change that. He ultimately made a new statement saying that he wants to basically dicker this out in court. So we can expect a new lawsuit for that. But things, too, ultimately weren't going overly well, because we ultimately had a lawsuit from Aetna Life Insurance Company saying that Intrepid Studios wasn't paying what they were owed for the services rendered, and this was filed in June of 2025, so it had been a while since they hadn't been paid. Also, we had SATA Systems basically filing for the same thing on December 1st of last year for, again, roughly $852,000, and basically, again, for not paying for services with the contract that they had from September of 2022. And despite multiple payment demands and eventual cancellation of the services in April of 2025, now they're seeking damages with a breach of contract to ultimately get paid. So no, things were not necessarily going well. And then two, we're finding out that there are also now several devs that are also suing as well. And they filed a lawsuit against Intrepid, which again, Intrepid doesn't even exist. But the private equity firm does, whoever they are. The suits were filed with former VX artist Noah Ortega, technical director Strange, and former gameplay engineer Jacob Burdecki, all of whom accused Intrepid of violating the WARN Act that were handed their walking papers by whatever entity owns the studio. And again, we don't even really know who this entity is or this private equity firm is, but apparently they do exist. Burdecki and Strange's class action lawsuit estimate that 200 employees were not given their required 60 days notice and not paid for accrued time off in the final weeks of work. Also, Ortega's lawsuit makes the same argument, noting that 123 employees were affected. So yeah, there's going to be multiple lawsuits. And then apparently we're also going to have one from Sharif as well. And yeah, this is just a total mess, unfortunately. So ultimately, with all of this happening, the players and Kickstarter backers, they're ultimately screwed too. Early access is no longer buyable on Steam, and Steam has issued a few refunds to multiple players. But Intrepid on their Kickstarter page also guaranteed refunds if something were to happen to the game, which probably not happening, unfortunately. But too, we would think that the private equity firm is now responsible. Again, I want to go back to the Kickstarter. We've got private backing that will allow us to produce a core viable product. Who are they? With these lawsuits, that is going to come out. There is going to come information during discovery, and we're going to see who they are. But again, how responsible are they? Well, they're the ones making all of the decisions, and apparently this private backing they've actually had for a while. Well, the funding period we actually get to see started on May 1st, 2017, and went until June of 17. But here is kind of my theory of what ultimately happened. See, originally they wanted $750,000 from crowdfunding to ultimately have enough, and also the private backing that they had to actually produce the game. Well, they ended up hitting over $3 million from crowdfunding from Kickstarter. And so, while there was more, that was ultimately promised. Kickstarter showed a lot more to the build of the game, too. Well, then we ended up having COVID and inflation, ultimately. And this ultimately hit the studio, which is maybe we kind of had a Kickstarter. But yeah, then we had COVID, where we shut down the economies of the world, basically, and stopped a lot of stuff. And then we also had the inflation with that, coupled with the artificial stimulus and PPP loans and all of that other kind of stuff all over the world. There was literally like $100 trillion dumped into the world economy in a very short amount of time. So inflation went up. That probably affected the studio, the wages, the servers, the other services they were using, licensing, all of this other kind of stuff. And they just couldn't, they just didn't have enough money. COVID 2 probably also slowed the development cycle, which lengthened how long they'd been making the game. Again, this has been 8 years that they've been working on it. The studio also, too, likely grew when they hit all of their post-funding goals and got that $3 million. Well, the money ultimately ran out, so the idea was, hey, let's launch it on Steam, which is not necessarily a good thing. And then again, Steam didn't necessarily go that well. There was a lot of work to be done. There was, again, things that were mounting. We also had the lawsuits from the other companies, Aetna and SATA, wanting their money with the services that they were basically giving. And there could also be some other companies out there too. Well, and when the decision was made to allegedly fire most of the people at Intrepid Studio and basically outsource the labor to another country, and then the leadership left, well, the private equity company just decided, hey, let's just stop the bleeding. But again, there were some things that weren't done correctly, and yeah, this is going to be kind of a mess. It makes me think of some other games too. We also had World of Eternum from Amazon. They seem to be actually doing pretty well, and then suddenly they weren't. We also had Atlas, which was a Xbox and also Steam video game, which again has had almost 10 years of development, but there just hasn't been any updates for a few years. And there's just real no focus on the game. It's just dead in the water. I also think, too, of World of Warcraft with all of the issues that they've had as an MMO. I also think of Pal World, which ended up launching January of 2024. And we do know that version 0.7 is coming soon and version 1.0 later in 2026, but we still don't have a date when that's actually coming. And I wouldn't be surprised if it actually gets pushed back into 2027. Also, Path of the Exile we had. Right now they're on patch 0.5 that they're currently working on and going to implement April 10th, 2026 of this year. But the launch date was December of 24, and they've had to push back when they're expecting version 1.0. And technically that's coming in 2026, but if they're launching 0.7 in April, I highly doubt they're going to meet that goal. So again, we're looking at 2027. Patch 0.6 is expected to come in August of 26. So yeah, they definitely need to speed things up. So 0.5 is coming in April 10th, and then 0.6 is expected in August. And then they're still saying that they want to launch the game 1.0 basically at the end of 2026. Good luck. I also think of Subnautica 2. This was also supposed to be in early access, supposed to release in April of 2025. This was actually supposed to be early access on Game Pass, which I was excited to try, but again, that never happened. All the stuff with Crafton and the studios and the leadership and all of that was totally a mess. Now it's expected that early access for 2026 this year sometime, but again, we don't have any date of when that's actually happening. I also think, too, which most of us probably know, is Star Citizen. This was released in 2014, and they've spent almost $1 billion. They've spent over $900 million so far. And version 1.0 has been pushed back so many times, I can't even keep track of it. And now, again, the release is supposed to be 2026, and also Squadron 42 has now also been pushed back to 2026. And I imagine both are likely to release, or at least the plan is probably to release both at the same time. But just with all of these examples, it's just to show that making these games, making the content, having enough money through COVID with the disruption and the stimulus money creating the inflation, and then too all of the AI stuff that we have going on right now, it's just brutal to actually try to get these games out. And I'm not saying that to try to like paper over what's happening with some of these companies and how some players too, or and backers in this case, are also getting screwed, or even to some of the employees, of course. Things need to be done in a proper and right way, and that's not necessarily happening. But these companies seem to be biting off too much or more than they can chew, and it's just creating more of a strain. And again, that's on the leadership's team. That's not really on anybody else. That's just on a few people. But if they're biting off a ton, if they're adding a whole bunch of stuff, can they do it in time? And people weren't expecting COVID. People weren't expecting the inflation that we had, which was way more than 9%. We all know that. And then, two, also the AI race, uh, charging up the cost for all of the hardware, basically. So we're going through that right now. And things are ultimately just more expensive, and none of this has really been planned for. And when things were more stable, hey, it was great. But, if you're going to give your money, of course it's your money. I'm not telling you what to do with it, but just be aware and be careful that a lot of this stuff, regardless of how the interviews are going, how you believe in the company and the people that are leading the projects, it can still go wrong. And everything looks good until you realize it's a facade and it's suddenly going horrible. And ultimately, what we usually find out is that it goes horrible for quite a while until something finally breaks. And that's what happened with Ashes of Creation. And there's just not much more we can do about that. So there will be some lawsuits, but people aren't really going to get their money back. Some people might get paid. We'll see if there's settlements. And we'll see, too, who this private equity firm is. But yeah, this is just another example and kind of a warning. Just be careful. Because some of these people with Ashes of Creation, they paid $10,000. I think two of the people that have paid hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions by now for Star Citizen. And again, it's just a mess, guys. So with that, folks, thanks for tuning in. If I earned it, definitely like, sub, all that stuff. Give it into the algos for me. And yeah, this is just disheartening. And MMOs, they take a lot of time and effort and money, and it's brutal. There used to be a ton out there, but boy, they're just having a hard time getting off the ground or even being sustainable. So with that, folks, I'll see you guys on the next one.